Erin had been driving for nearly 6 hours, her back aching and her eyes growing heavy as she navigated the empty stretch of highway that wound through the desert. She had left late from a business meeting in Albuquerque, determined to make it back to her home in Tucson by morning. The late-night drive didn't bother her. She had done it dozens of times before. The road was barren, the only company the occasional tumbleweed that rolled across the asphalt. Erin reached over to the passenger seat, grabbing a cold energy drink from the cup holder and cracking it open. The sharp, fizzy taste jolted her senses momentarily. She glanced at the GPS on her phone, which reassured her that she was on track. But as she approached a highway sign, she frowned. The sign read, Highway 77 closed. Detour ahead. She hadn't seen any warnings about construction before leaving, and the detour wasn't marked on her GPS. The alternate route pointed to an old, cracked road that veered sharply to the right, disappearing into the darkness. "This better not take too long," Erin muttered, turning onto the detour. The road was rough and uneven, and her car's tires crunched over loose gravel. It felt like she was driving into nowhere, the desert's endless expanse stretching out on either side. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the landscape, but the farther she drove, the darker it seemed to get. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The detour road didn't reconnect with the highway as Erin had expected. Instead, it twisted and turned, the pavement giving way to dirt. She checked her phone, but the screen was frozen, the GPS stuck on a blank map. "Great," she muttered, smacking the side of the phone. The headlights of her car struggled to cut through the thickening fog that had suddenly rolled in. The beams diffused into a hazy glow. It didn't make sense. Fog in the middle of the desert? She slowed the car, her unease growing with every mile. Then she saw it, a shape on the side of the road, barely visible through the fog. As she got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a sign, old and weathered, with faded letters that read, "Welcome to Silver Creek." Erin frowned. She had never heard of Silver Creek, and it certainly wasn't on her route. She considered turning back, but the road was too narrow, and there hadn't been a shoulder wide enough to turn around in miles. The road narrowed even further as she passed the sign, the landscape shifting. The desert scrub and cacti were gone, replaced by gnarled trees that looked like they belonged in a swamp. The road ahead split suddenly, with no signs to indicate which way to go. "Okay, this is ridiculous," Erin said aloud, gripping the wheel tightly. She decided to take the left fork, the tires kicking up dust as she drove deeper into the strange forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. Her unease turned to alarm when she saw the first house. It was a ramshackle structure, its roof sagging and its windows shattered. A faint light flickered inside, like a dying candle. Erin slowed the car, her eyes fixed on the house as she passed. That's when she saw the figure. It stood in the window, motionless, its face obscured by the shadows. Erin's breath caught in her throat as the figure raised its hand and pointed directly at her. She pressed the gas pedal, her heart pounding as the house disappeared behind her. The road twisted sharply, and she gripped the wheel, trying to calm her racing thoughts. But then she saw another house, and another. Each one looked identical to the first, dilapidated, with faint flickering lights and figures standing in the windows, all pointing at her. "What the hell is this?" Erin whispered, her voice trembling. The fog grew thicker, and the trees seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Erin's headlights flickered, and the car sputtered, the engine struggling as if something was dragging it down. Ahead, the road opened into a clearing, and in the center stood a massive building. A motel, its neon sign blinking erratically. The sign read, "Silver Creek Motel. Vacancy." Erin pulled into the parking lot, her hands shaking as she put the car in park. The motel looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, its paint peeling and its windows coated in grime. But what made her stomach churn was the parking lot. Every car was identical to hers. She stepped out cautiously, her eyes darting around the lot. Each car was the same make and model, even the same color. Some had rusted over, while others looked brand new, but they all bore the same license plate. Hers. "This isn't real," Erin muttered, backing toward her car. As she reached for the door handle, she heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Her eyes snapped to the motel. The front door was open now, and a faint light spilled out, casting long shadows on the pavement. Erin's instincts screamed at her to leave, but her feet refused to move. She watched, frozen, as a figure emerged from the motel. It was humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements too smooth. Its face was featureless, save for a gaping mouth that twisted into a grotesque smile. "Come inside," it said, its voice a chilling blend of whispers and static. Erin bolted back to her car, fumbling with the keys as the figure moved closer. The growling grew louder, and she realized it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the forest, the shadows between the trees writhing like living things. The engine roared to life, and Erin threw the car into reverse, her tires screeching as she sped out of the lot. The road twisted violently, the fog thickening until she could barely see. The growling followed her, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to seep into her mind. Just as she thought she would never escape, the fog lifted, and the trees gave way to the open desert once more. Erin slammed on the brakes, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The highway was ahead, its familiar asphalt a welcome sight. She merged back onto the road, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind her. No fog, no figures, no motel. She drove the rest of the way home without stopping, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Weeks later, she passed the detour sign again, this time in broad daylight. She pulled over, determined to see where the road led. But when she got out of the car, there was no road. Just endless desert, untouched and unmarked. Erin never took Highway 77 again. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of the motel and wakes up to the faint sound of growling outside her window. It was a little past midnight, and Greg Dalton was just trying to make it home. He had been working late at a client's office 2 towns over, and the 2-hour highway drive was supposed to be simple, just long, dark stretches of road with the occasional rest stop to break up the monotony. Greg had made the drive dozens of times before, but that night, the road felt different. The air was thick, heavy with an almost suffocating stillness, and the usual rhythm of his tires on the pavement seemed muted. Even his favorite playlist, typically a source of comfort, felt distant and hollow as it played through the car speakers. The first sign that something was wrong came about 40 minutes into the drive when Greg spotted a semi-truck in his rearview mirror. The truck was massive, with blindingly bright headlights that seemed far too high off the ground. Greg squinted as the lights grew closer, eventually filling the mirror completely. The truck was tailgating him now, far too close for comfort. "What the hell is this guy's problem?" Greg muttered, tapping his brakes lightly in hopes of signaling the driver to back off. Instead, the truck responded by flashing its high beams, bathing the inside of Greg's car in an intense white light. He swerved slightly, his pulse quickening as he gripped the wheel. Greg sped up, hoping to put some distance between himself and the truck, but it followed suit, matching his speed effortlessly. He glanced at the speedometer. 75 miles per hour, then 80, then 85. But the truck stayed glued to his bumper, its high beams unwavering. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he approached an off-ramp. Without thinking, Greg veered onto it, hoping to lose the truck. He glanced back once he was on the exit ramp, but the truck was gone. He exhaled, laughing nervously. "Idiot must have missed the turn," he said aloud, though the relief was short-lived. As Greg merged onto a smaller highway, the truck appeared again, this time ahead of him. It seemed to materialize out of nowhere, its taillights glowing faintly in the distance. How the hell? Greg trailed off, his hands tightening on the wheel. He slowed down, putting as much space between himself and the truck as possible, but after a few minutes, its brake lights flared, and the vehicle slowed to match his speed. It was taunting him now, inching closer and closer until Greg could see the back of the trailer in perfect detail. It was old and rusted, with strange, almost organic markings etched into the metal, lines that didn't look like graffiti but more like scars. Greg decided he had had enough. He pulled onto the shoulder, intending to let the truck pass, but it stopped too, its lights flickering briefly before going dark. The highway was silent now, save for the faint hum of Greg's engine. He stared at the truck, his heart pounding. Then, slowly, the truck's cab door opened. A figure stepped out, but it was hard to make out any details in the darkness. It looked human, tall, broad-shouldered, but something about its movements was wrong. It didn't walk so much as glide, its feet making no sound on the pavement. "Stay in the car," Greg muttered to himself, his breathing shallow. The figure began walking toward him, its pace steady, deliberate. Greg fumbled for his phone, his shaking hands barely able to dial 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the speaker. There's someone on the highway, Greg stammered, glancing back at the figure, which had stopped just a few feet from his car. They got out of a truck, and now they're just standing there. The line went dead. Hello? Greg shouted into the phone, but there was no response, just static. When he looked up again, the figure was gone. Greg sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, his eyes scanning the darkness. The truck, the figure. Everything had vanished, leaving him alone on the silent highway. He didn't think twice about it. Greg slammed his car into gear and sped off, his eyes darting between the road ahead and his rearview mirror. It wasn't until he reached the next rest stop that he dared to pull over. The lot was empty, save for a single flickering streetlight casting long shadows across the asphalt. As Greg stepped out of the car, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Scratched into the paint on the side of his vehicle were the same markings he'd seen on the truck's trailer. The lines seemed to shimmer faintly, almost alive, and as Greg stared at them, a faint, low hum filled the air. Greg didn't stick around to investigate. He jumped back into his car and drove the rest of the way home without stopping. The following day, he tried to convince himself it had been a bad dream, but the scratches on his car told a different story. When he tried to wash them off, the markings wouldn't budge, as though they had been burned into the metal. Weeks later, Greg received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with a crude drawing of the truck, the same strange markings etched into its trailer. At the bottom of the page were 3 words, "See you soon." Greg sold his car the next day, but sometimes, when he's driving late at night, he sees headlights in his rearview mirror, too high off the ground to be a regular vehicle. And every time, he wonders if the truck is still out there, waiting for him. It was supposed to be a straightforward road trip. Sam and his wife, Kelly, were driving from Denver to Phoenix to visit Kelly's sister for the weekend. The drive was long, nearly 12 hours, but they had done it before, and the sprawling desert landscapes always made the time pass quickly. This time, though, they were running late. They hadn't left until almost 5 p.m., and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, they were still hours away from their destination. The dark, open road stretched endlessly ahead, illuminated only by their headlights and the faint glow of the moon. Sam yawned, glancing over at Kelly, who was scrolling through her phone. "We should have left earlier," he said. "I know," Kelly replied, not looking up. "We'll get there. Just don't fall asleep on me." Sam chuckled and adjusted his grip on the wheel. That's when they saw the detour sign. It was bright orange and reflective, placed haphazardly in the middle of the road. Big, blocky letters read, "Road closed, detour ahead." "What's this about?" Kelly asked, sitting up. Sam frowned. "I don't know. This highway's never been closed before." Sure enough, as they drove a little farther, they saw a set of barricades blocking the road. To the right was a dirt path with another sign indicating the detour. "I guess we have no choice," Sam said, turning onto the path. The dirt road was rough and uneven, lined with scrubby bushes and the occasional gnarled tree. It twisted and turned unpredictably, the headlights barely keeping up with the sharp bends. "This doesn't look official," Kelly said, glancing out the window. "It's probably temporary," Sam replied, though his grip on the wheel tightened. As they continued, the road seemed to grow narrower, the trees pressing closer together. The GPS on Kelly's phone had stopped working shortly after they turned onto the detour, and now the screen displayed nothing but a blank map. Is it just me, or have we been driving forever? Kelly asked, her voice tinged with unease. Sam glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It read 10:30 p.m., though it felt much later. We'll get back to the highway soon, he said, more to reassure himself than her. That's when they saw the headlights. At first, they were just two faint pinpricks in the distance, slowly growing brighter. A car was approaching, though it was moving unusually slowly. Finally, someone else, Kelly said, leaning forward. As the vehicle drew closer, Sam realized something was off. The headlights were dim and uneven, flickering faintly as if they were struggling to stay lit. The car passed them without slowing down, but as it did, Kelly gasped. "Sam, did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What?" "The driver. There wasn't one." Sam's hands tightened on the wheel. "Don't be ridiculous. You must have just missed them." But Kelly shook her head, her face pale. "No, Sam. There was no one in that car." He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the vehicle was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. Unease settled over them as they continued down the dirt road. The trees seemed taller now, their branches arching overhead to form a tunnel. The air grew colder, and the engine began to sputter faintly. The next strange thing they noticed was the sign. It was identical to the one they had seen at the start of the detour. "Road closed, detour ahead." "That can't be right," Sam said, slowing the car. "We didn't turn around." Kelly's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are we going in circles?" Sam shook his head, refusing to believe it. He accelerated, determined to reach the highway, but the road only seemed to twist and turn more erratically. The trees loomed closer, their trunks impossibly gnarled, and the dirt path grew rougher with each passing mile. Then they saw it again. The same car, its dim headlights flickering as it approached from the opposite direction. "No," Kelly whispered, gripping the armrest. This time, the car slowed as it passed, and Sam got a good look inside. She was right, there was no driver. Instead, the passenger seat was occupied by something. At first, it looked like a pile of dark fabric, but as the car crept by, Sam realized it was moving. It was a figure, hunched over, its form writhing as if it were trying to take shape. He slammed on the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped away. The road began to change. The trees disappeared, replaced by tall, jagged rocks that seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. The dirt path widened into a smooth, black surface, but it wasn't asphalt. It was too shiny, too reflective, like glass. "What is this place?" Kelly asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Sam replied, glancing at the GPS again. The screen was still blank, but the clock now read 3:17 a.m. "That can't be right," he muttered. It was just 10:30. The headlights appeared again, but this time, they were in front of them. "Is it waiting for us?" Kelly asked, her voice barely audible. Sam didn't answer. He slowed the car as they approached the phantom vehicle, which sat motionless in the middle of the road. The figure in the passenger seat was clearer now, its form more defined. It had a face, but it was wrong. Its features stretched and distorted as if it were wearing a mask made of flesh. "Turn around," Kelly pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Before Sam could react, the figure raised its hand and pointed directly at them. The headlights of the phantom car flared, flooding the road with blinding light. Sam shielded his eyes, but the car's engine roared, and the vehicle began to move, straight toward them. "Hold on," Sam shouted, yanking the wheel hard to the left. The car skidded, its tires screeching as it narrowly avoided the oncoming vehicle. When the light faded, the phantom car was gone, and they were back on the dirt road. Neither of them spoke as they drove, the tension in the car palpable. After what felt like an eternity, they saw the familiar glow of highway lights in the distance. They merged back onto the main road in silence, the sound of their tires on asphalt a welcome relief. But as they passed the first rest stop, they noticed something chilling. Parked in the lot, bathed in the dim glow of a streetlight, was the same phantom car. Its headlights were off, but the figure in the passenger seat was still there, watching them as they drove by. To this day, Sam and Kelly refuse to take detours on road trips. They don't know where that road led, or what the figure in the phantom car wanted. But sometimes, on dark nights, Sam sees flickering headlights in his rearview mirror and wonders if it's still following them. Jason Evans was used to long drives. As a traveling salesman, he'd spent more nights on the road than he cared to admit. Highways had become his second home. The monotonous stretches of asphalt broken only by the occasional truck stop or gas station. This particular night, Jason was heading southbound on a remote highway that cut through the Midwest, a route he'd taken many times before. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m., and the only light came from his high beams and the occasional flicker of distant lightning. He had been driving for hours, his thermos of coffee long empty, when he noticed something unusual. A mile marker ahead, barely visible in the dark. It was tilted at an odd angle, the reflective numbers, 237, almost obscured by grime. Jason slowed slightly as he passed it, his eyes lingering on the marker. He couldn't explain why, but something about it felt off. The road stretched on, endless and empty. Jason fiddled with the radio, but all he could pick up was static. He sighed and leaned back, focusing on the rhythm of the road. That's when he saw the shape. At first, it was just a blur in the distance, a vague, dark figure standing on the shoulder of the road. Jason squinted, trying to make it out. It wasn't uncommon to see hitchhikers or stranded drivers late at night, but as he got closer, the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its back to him, silhouetted against the faint glow of his headlights. Jason's grip on the wheel tightened as he slowed down, debating whether to stop. He rolled down the passenger window slightly, the cool night air rushing in. "Hey, you okay?" he called out. The figure didn't respond. It was tall, with long, thin limbs and a posture that seemed unnaturally rigid. Jason's unease grew as he noticed its head tilted to the side, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. "Do you need help?" He tried again, louder this time. The figure moved, just barely. Its head turned slightly, but not enough for Jason to see its face. Something about the motion was wrong, like a puppet on strings. Jason decided to keep driving. "Not my problem," he muttered, rolling the window back up and pressing on the gas. The figure disappeared into the darkness behind him, and he tried to shake the eerie feeling it left in its wake. But a few miles down the road, he saw it again. It was standing on the shoulder, in the exact same position, its back to him and its head tilted. Jason's pulse quickened. "What the hell?" he muttered, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. There was no way it could have gotten ahead of him. He hadn't passed any turnoffs or intersections. It was just a straight stretch of highway. This time, Jason didn't slow down. He sped past the figure, refusing to look directly at it. His heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the wheel, his knuckles white. A few minutes later, he spotted a rest stop ahead, a small building with a single flickering light in the parking lot. Relieved, he pulled in, the tires crunching on the gravel. The lot was empty, save for an old pickup truck parked near the entrance. Jason stepped out, stretching his legs and glancing around. As he walked toward the vending machines, he froze. The figure was there, standing just beyond the edge of the lot, half hidden in the shadows of the trees. Jason's breath caught in his throat. The figure was closer now, and he could make out more details. Its arms hung limply at its sides, the fingers unnaturally long, almost claw-like. Its head was still tilted, but the angle was sharper, as though it were broken. "Hey!" Jason shouted, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move. Jason backed toward his car, his heart racing. He fumbled with the door handle, throwing himself inside and locking the doors. As he started the engine, the headlights illuminated the figure fully for the first time. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its frame, its eyes black voids that seemed to absorb the light. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth. Jason didn't wait to see what it would do. He slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as he sped out of the lot. He drove faster than he ever had, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The figure was gone, but the unease lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Mile marker 237 appeared again, leaning at the same odd angle. Jason's stomach churned as he realized he was somehow back where he started. The radio crackled to life, filling the car with static. Then, faintly, a voice emerged. "Why did you leave?" Jason's hands shook as he adjusted the dial, but the voice persisted, growing louder. "You shouldn't have left." Suddenly, the car jolted, as if something had struck it from behind. Jason's heart raced as he glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was there, clinging to the back of the car, its black eyes locked onto his. Jason screamed, swerving wildly as he tried to shake it off. The car fishtailed, and the figure was flung into the darkness. Gasping for breath, Jason steadied the wheel and pressed on, refusing to stop. The static on the radio faded, replaced by an eerie silence. Hours later, Jason finally saw the glow of city lights on the horizon. Relief washed over him as he merged onto a busier highway, other cars appearing around him. He pulled into a gas station at the edge of town, his hands still trembling as he stepped out of the car. As he filled the tank, he glanced at the back of the vehicle and froze. Scratched into the paint were the words, "See you at 2:37. Jason quit his job the next day, vowing never to drive that route again. But sometimes, late at night, he hears static on the radio and wonders if the figure is still waiting for him. Kyle Harris wasn't new to long road trips. As a freelance journalist, he often traveled across the country for stories, spending countless nights on the highway, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the radio to keep him company. He had seen his share of odd things on the road. Deer leaping out of nowhere, strange graffiti on abandoned buildings, but nothing like what he would encounter that night. He was driving on Highway 62, a remote stretch of road that cut through miles of farmland and forests. His destination was still 2 hours away, and he'd planned to stop at a motel near the next town. It was nearing midnight, and the road ahead was empty, the pale glow of the moon reflecting off the cracked asphalt. Kyle glanced at his fuel gauge, frowning as the needle hovered just above empty. He knew there was a gas station about 20 miles ahead and prayed he'd make it without breaking down. The first strange thing he noticed was the overpass. It loomed ahead, a skeletal structure of rusted metal and crumbling concrete, spanning the highway like a forgotten relic. It wasn't on his GPS, and he didn't remember seeing it the last time he'd driven this route. As he approached, his headlights illuminated graffiti scrawled across the supports, strange, jagged symbols that didn't resemble any language he recognized. Kyle slowed the car, his curiosity piqued, but a sudden movement on the overpass caught his eye. A man was standing there, silhouetted against the moonlight. Kyle squinted, trying to get a better look. The man stood perfectly still, his arms at his sides, staring down at the highway below. He was too far away for Kyle to make out any details, but something about his posture was unnerving. As Kyle passed beneath the overpass, he craned his neck to look up, but the man was gone. He shook his head, laughing nervously to himself. "Probably just a hitchhiker," he muttered. But a few miles down the road, the uneasy feeling lingered. The radio crackled suddenly, breaking the silence. Kyle adjusted the dial, but all he could pick up was static. Then, faintly, he heard a voice. "Turn back," it whispered. Kyle's grip on the wheel tightened. He glanced at the radio, but the static was gone, replaced by the soft strains of a country song. "Must be the signal out here," he muttered, though the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He saw the overpass again 10 minutes later. Kyle blinked, confused. He hadn't made any turns, and the highway was a straight shot. But there it was, the same rusted structure, the same graffiti. And the man was there again, standing in the exact same spot. Kyle slowed the car, his eyes fixed on the figure. This time, the man moved. He raised one hand, pointing directly at Kyle. A chill ran down Kyle's spine as he pressed the gas pedal, speeding away from the overpass. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the man was gone. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, his heart pounding. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows along the highway seemed to shift and ripple, as if something was moving just beyond the reach of his headlights. When he saw the overpass a third time, he slammed on the brakes, his tires screeching as the car came to a halt. This time, the man was standing on the road itself, directly in Kyle's path. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The man was tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. He wore a tattered coat that flapped in the breeze, and his head tilted slightly, as if studying Kyle. Kyle reached for his phone, but there was no signal. "Hey!" Kyle shouted, rolling down the window slightly. "What are you doing out here?" The man didn't respond. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Kyle's instincts screamed at him to drive, but his hands seemed frozen on the wheel. The man took another step, his face coming into view. Kyle gasped. The man's eyes were black voids, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile that stretched far too wide. Kyle didn't think. He slammed the car into reverse, his tires kicking up gravel as he backed away. The man stood motionless, his smile unchanging as Kyle sped down the highway in the wrong direction. The radio crackled again, the static louder this time. Kyle reached to turn it off, but a voice cut through, clear and cold. "You can't run." Kyle's pulse raced as he floored the gas pedal, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The overpass loomed ahead once more, but this time, something was different. The graffiti on the supports seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with an unnatural light. And the man was there, standing in the center of the road, flanked by two others. They were identical to him, tall, thin, with black eyes and twisted smiles. Kyle's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, swerving onto the shoulder to avoid them. The car jolted violently, the engine sputtering as he fought to regain control. When he looked back, the figures were gone. Kyle's headlights illuminated a gas station up ahead, its neon sign flickering weakly. Relief flooded through him as he pulled into the lot, the engine wheezing as he shut it off. The station was deserted, the windows dark and the pumps rusted. But Kyle didn't care. He just needed a moment to collect himself. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. That's when he saw the graffiti. It was scrawled across the side of the gas station in the same jagged symbols he'd seen on the overpass. Kyle's stomach churned as he realized the symbols were moving, shifting like they were alive. A low, guttural sound echoed from behind the station, and Kyle turned slowly, his heart pounding. The man was there, standing at the edge of the lot, his black eyes glinting in the dim light. "You shouldn't have stopped," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. Kyle bolted back to the car, his hands fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life, and he peeled out of the lot, the tires screeching as he sped back onto the highway. The overpass appeared again almost immediately, the figures now lining the sides of the road. They watched silently as Kyle passed, their smiles widening. Kyle drove for hours, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. When the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, he finally saw the exit for his hometown. He pulled into his driveway, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. But as he stepped out of the car, he froze. Spray painted across his garage door were the same jagged symbols, and scrawled beneath them were the words, "Welcome home."